Is foresight more of an art or a science?
Foresight at moments can be a science, but for foresight to really have impact, it must be an art. The point of foresight is not to predict the future, but to anticipate the full range of possibilities that lie ahead.
Every organization, institution on the planet has an identity, which is stable. But then the world changes, it goes to disequilibrium. So our role as futurists is to help create the new equilibrium.
We need a diversity of futures. We also need some common values if we are going to have a collective trajectory that serves all life on Earth.
We can start to really explore and understand how we would want to shape the future for the humans, the species, the beings who will be living there.
When you are firefighting what's in front of you today, it's really hard to imagine anything else. We feel like we're in a constant state of crises. So the art of imagination becomes integral in that.
Our actions in the present shape the outcomes in the future. The point of forecasting is to change our actions in the present. The tools help you get part of the way there. Intuition gets you the rest of the way. So think of tools and methods as just heuristics, rules of thumb that help you get to that place where you can answer something with conviction. I think of it as mapping a cone of uncertainty that extends out into the future. The challenge is to not map the cone so broadly that you waste your time on things that may never happen, but also don't map it so narrowly that you miss possibilities and surprises.
So CLA, or cognitive analysis, suggests it's 4 levels of reality. Level 1 is the data. Could be debts, it could be illnesses, it could be profit. That's how the physical world is apparently real. Level 2 is systems. Those could be technology, society, laws, regulation. They underneath the litany, the data. Level 3 is worldview or culture, and level 4 are myths and metaphors. So our perspective is, if you want to transform today into a different future, you need to work at all 4 levels. You have to change the story, you have to change the worldview, you have to change the rules, and you have to change the data.
There's an old accusation leveled at some folks who are in the prediction business saying, you're using a rear view mirror to look into the future. Well, I'm here to tell you that rear view mirrors are actually very useful tools for foresight, and frankly, they're the only tool we have. The only thing we have is history. The problem is most people look at history the wrong way. They look at events. What you want to do is look at history in terms of patterns. One rule of thumb I follow is always look back twice as far as you're looking forward so you can see what the pattern is.
In traditional foresight practices, it assumes change happens like in a linear way. Climate change, technology, geopolitical changes. But in fact, we live in a time at the moment that experts are calling the polycrisis, which means how different risks are intersecting at the same time. So something that assuredly might be seen as a local problem can very quickly become a global problem. That's the challenge of our times. We need to understand how quickly the system is reacting, and almost like a domino effect that will impact the rest of us.
It may turn out that the smallest of something that seems out of place is the tip of something very, very big coming into the future. And if you listen to the whispers of the zeitgeist, sometimes it whispers back and it says, watch out, there's something very big over the horizon coming.
There have been times in history where humanity has been particularly destructive en masse. We didn't have the technology and science to ensure that that destruction could threaten our very survival as a species. And now we have that. So whether it is human-induced climate change, biodiversity loss, unchecked AI, biological warfare, nuclear weapons. We are generating a huge number of existential threats to ourselves as a species. And along the way, we are taking many other species with us.
We are chasing this idea of a technology-driven future, but in fact, a lot of innovation is born from how we treat each other, how we treat human and non-human beings, how we treat nature, and the lessons that our ancestors have taught us about how we build community, how we build trust, is an integral part of how we can bring that into the future.
Right now, infrastructure is a dimension of GDP. What if infrastructure was about well-being? In that sense, suddenly now it's not just about roads. It's walking, it's fresh water, it's access to culture. So once we switch to well-being, then we're counting different things and creating different futures.
We use our technologies to reinvent ourselves as individuals, as communities, and entire cultures. Technology changes nothing. Technology creates possibilities that we all, as individuals and as entire societies, decide how to use or not to use at all. So rather than saying I'm being swept along in this current of technological change, say I am part of the change, how do I help shape it?
You can imagine about all the things that excite us, right? The singularity is coming, artificial intelligence is changing the work. We're not going to die anymore, right? Longevity, science, all these are very exciting things. But if you think about it, they all point to a very narrow future. In 2045, we're going to have machines that solve every problem. Amazing, very attractive. It almost looks like a religion, but that's a very singular future. That's only one option. There are a range of possible options out there that we need to consider. And doing that, we're less biased. Our job as foresight practitioners is to stop getting fixated on these trends. The trends are actually the present. If we project these trends, that's not the future. It's a projection of the present. So we need to expand that range of possibilities and make it futures in plural form.
Danger is if you begin to think that technology changes things, then you have the risk of becoming like a modern-day cargo cult, where you're worshiping the object and forgetting that the agent of change is you, is your community, is your society. Culture, individuals are the agents of change.
Possible future, there is a chance it could happen. A plausible future, it may not quite work out that way. A probable future is something that says this is a high probability this could occur, and the preferred future is the one that, that we prefer. Often we think about the future in these abstract terms, probable, plausible, or preferred, for whom? Whose future are we talking about there? And that's where your positionality comes in. If I am managing or leading a foresight process, my position and the values I bring influences that process. So if you're trying to facilitate a process in a context that's very different from where you are at, acknowledging the positionality that you're coming into it matters.
When I think about whether we're heading towards a dystopian or utopian space moving forward, I don't think about it in terms of those binary divides. One person's utopia is another person's dystopia. So really appreciating that, again, what works for one person is not necessarily going to be so great for another person makes these spaces in which we discuss the ramifications of the experiences that we have when we are able to explore what these future trajectories of change could be.
I think it's very important to never lose sight of the fact that even if you're forecasting for a large organization or thinking about global futures, you've always got to bring it down to yourself. You have to begin by placing yourself into the future. It becomes an anchor point, a reference point to make sure that you don't get lost in the wilderness of possibilities.
It's moving people from structure, which is the science part, measurable, causative, to the art part, which is personal inspiration, connecting with future generations and that feeling of the future.
There has been a long debate about whether foresight is art or science. Foresight at moments can be a science, but for foresight to really have impact, it must be an art. And it's a way of thinking about life that one applies artful thinking to.
The science part is structure. What are the patterns of history that we can see? Novelty has a pattern, we can see it. So that's the science part. We have methods that work, they have a structure to it. The art part is who am I, who are you in the room? The ability to connect, to learn from others, to get them to see that the future is a feeling.
As humans, we are deeply emotional, messy beings. The more we find out about the way our brains work, the more we discover how irrational we are. The word emotion comes from the Latin movare, to move. Emotions move us. And stories are vehicles for emotions. So if we want to move people, we have to be dealing at the level of emotions. We have to be dealing at the level of story and narrative. And actually, our narratives are like the operating system for everything in our society.
Human beings are storytellers. Human beings in themselves are a story. We get that from our parents, especially generally from mothers who are storytellers, giving children stories about who they can be. The issue for us, many of these traditional stories are past-based. Sometimes master storytellers still tell stories of exclusion, where in fact they create a future where pain is amplified. So we want to rewrite stories that are far more inclusive, far more pluralistic, far more towards a greener planet. A good story should also be fact-based in terms of the facts we wish to see, the future we wish to create. So we're not going away from data, we're saying in fact reality is 4 levels: data, system, culture, metaphor. And the best social science, the best critical theory, the best futures is inclusive of all of them.
The personal aspects that happen when we engage with the future give us a few different benefits that can be very powerful. One of them is that they store more detailed, richer memories. So the part of our brain that envisions possible futures, that imagines what could be, sits very close to the part of our brain that houses our memories. So when we imagine possible futures, we're remixing the memories that we have. Researchers have found that that creates a greater sense of personal autonomy, strength, and resilience. So when we do that work together, we start to create social resilience. And that's really given community, a given group's capacity to navigate, tolerate, and absorb various kinds of disturbances and threats.
Our practices in foresight have to deeply understand what inequality and injustice looks like. Because if not, what we're doing is we are privileging the visions of a select few people in terms of building those ideas about the future. If we don't understand what has happened in our history, we don't understand how inequity and injustice looks like today and the systems that corral that, we will inadvertently just bring that into the future.
My name is Iruwira Tarina. I come from an iwi, a Māori indigenous tribe of New Zealand called Ngaitahu, who occupy New Zealand's South Island. If a community has been struggling for 180 years and hasn't had the opportunity to exercise power or decision making, the lack of collective imagination is a bit of a barrier. So one of the things I would like to think about, well, how do we support the growth of futures literacy, futures capability, and also the ability of our young people to dream and to be able to marry that up with good tools, practices, and strategies so that they can kind of bridge that gap between aspiration and action. How can they not only be equipped to have a better dream of a better future, but they also have solid, concrete pathways to make that a reality?
What I've learned from my Indigenous colleagues is nothing about us without us. In conversations with Indigenous people around the world, what they tell me, CLA is actually an Indigenous methodology that links us to modernist science. So now we have the link. We can link our stories to the data sets, to the scientific systems, so those who are different from us can understand us.
There is clearly an awful lot that we can learn from Indigenous cultures, and there is a phrase that the future is Indigenous. And I think we need to be aware that when we use Indigenous wisdom, we mustn't appropriate that wisdom. The question is how we can work with an Indigenous insight in ways that are equitable, how we can support Indigenous societies which are continuing to struggle for their survival. The knowledge systems they have are so important for our collective future, and that we must not only work to highlight the knowledge systems, but we must work to protect the cultures that they come from.
Pai tawhiti whaia kia tata, ko te pai tata whakamaua kia tina. Strive for those distant shores, but always treasure the ones you attain. And it's a really useful philosophy to go, well, what got us here won't get us there. So we can acknowledge that we've made great progress in the last 25 years, but also where we are now, it's going to be declining less and less value, that we can't just sit on this island here, we have to keep going further on that journey. That's the beauty of an intergenerational approach, is you can acknowledge the contributions and legacy of those that are not here with us today, but also we are handing down that legacy to the coming generations.
All of us are ancestors, whether we have children or not. All of us are determining the future that will come. And the more we can step into our power as ancestors, the more we can think like ancestors and act like good ones, the better our collective future will be.
Climate change is something that transforms the world in which we live today. And if we think 2 or 3 generations ahead, which is a good time frame for much policy, and then they will live in a world in which they cannot behave like we do. Not all of them will be able to stay in the same places where maybe their grandparents come from. So we need to give them the possibilities to make changes in their life, to adopt different behavior, to live in different places, to build different communities than what we are used to. That's an important factor that we can influence today, for example, through the narratives that we leave behind, the identities that we let them build in the future.
We have the duty to leave the world in a place where generations that are not born yet have opportunities, have the resources at hand, have the tools, and have also the ability to live in a livable planet. So it's really important that as we are making decisions, especially at a government level, for example, that we find ways of bringing in the perspectives of children and young people. Youth foresight, we see it as a function that can help us bridge the empathy gap between those in power and children and young people. And again, it's not only about their inclusion, but it's about how we engage them.
If we can create futures that are designed in plurality, that do not harm each other, but everybody has the ability to just lead their lives in the way that best fits them. That's the mosaic of our wonderful world, is the difference between all of us. That's a peaceful future.
It feels very important to have spaces where people can connect with the future, to have spaces like the Museum of the Future, where we can start to feel into what the future might be, where we can start to think into the world beyond our lifetimes. As humans, we find it very hard to grapple with our mortality and to think that there will be a world that exists when we are no longer in it. So the more we can have tools and creative experiences to help us step into that future, step into the world that will exist when we are no longer in it, the better we will be able to start to take responsibility for that future and to shape it.